Life out here had its own rhythm, slow, steady, and untangled from the chaos most folks seem to thrive on. My mornings began with the rustle of wind through tall grass and the low hum of cicadas warming up for the day. Beyond my wooden porch stretched a wide spread of open land, framed by rolling hills that looked like they'd been painted in every shade of gold and green. There was a kind of freedom in that space, freedom you could feel deep in your chest. Out here, you knew where your boundaries were, and more importantly, so did everyone else. That morning had been no different, at least at first. The air carried that crisp edge that only comes right before spring decides to truly settle in. My cattle moved slow, grazing on patches of fresh growth while the barn's old tin roof groaned in the warming sun. Even the gate at the end of my drive, sturdy iron bars I'd installed myself, stood quiet, framed by weathered fence posts and a private property sign so clear it could be read from the next county over. That gate was more than metal, was a line in the dirt, a promise to myself that what was mine would stay mine. I'd worked years to build this life. Every fence post I'd driven into the ground had a story. Every plank of my barn, every groove in the porch rail, came from my hands and my sweat. I wasn't rich in the ways city folks measured it, but I had something better: autonomy. No one told me how to paint my porch, what flowers I could plant, or when I could hang Christmas lights. I didn't need permission to live the way I wanted, and yet trouble has a way of finding people who least want it. It started with a ripple, small enough to ignore at first. Whispers from neighbors about a newly formed homeowners association just outside the old boundary line. They were buying up property, talking about community improvements and uniform standards. Words like that set my teeth on edge. Standards were fine when you set them for yourself, but these folks didn't seem interested in anyone else's say. They were flashy types, polished SUVs, golf polos, little dogs in sweaters. People who measured their worth in lawn height and mailbox designs. I figured they'd keep to their side of the fence. After all, I wasn't part of their subdivision. My land wasn't carved out of their grid of paved streets and manicured lawns. My gate wasn't a decorative flourish, it was a barrier that said, in no uncertain terms, not your jurisdiction. But the thing about people drunk on rules is they start thinking they can enforce them anywhere. And sooner or later, they find a way to justify knocking on a door that doesn't belong to them. It happened in the late morning, when the sun had settled into a steady climb and the shadows were short. I was up by the barn, sorting through a stack of hay bales for the afternoon feed, when I saw movement down by the gate. At first, I thought it was a lost delivery truck or some city tourist who'd taken a wrong turn and thought my driveway was part of a scenic route. But then I caught the gleam of clipboards and the telltale line of matching blue polos. HOA officers, 3 of them, standing just beyond the gate like they owned the place. One leaned on the fence post, another scribbled something on a notepad, and the third scanned the property like he was appraising it for resale. Their posture told me everything. They weren't here to say hello. They were here with a purpose, and it wasn't going to be one I'd like. Even from that distance, I could feel the shift in the air. The easy calm of my morning had been punctured by something sharp and insistent. These were people who didn't just see a gate, they saw an obstacle to be pushed through. And push they would, because that's what people like them did. The sound of the wind in the trees seemed to fade as I watched them. My cattle, sensing something off, lifted their heads from the grass, their ears flicking in unison. Even my old hound, usually asleep by this time of day, had wandered out to the edge of the porch, his tail-stiff eyes locked on the intruders. The gate itself seemed to stand taller under their scrutiny, the iron bars glinting in the sunlight. That gate was my statement to the world, my shield against exactly this sort of nonsense. I'd installed it knowing one day I might have to stand behind it. But I hadn't figured that day would come quite so soon. For a long moment, I stayed still, just watching. They hadn't seen me yet, and in that stillness, my mind started working. Not with fear, but with calculation. I could already tell these weren't the type to be satisfied with polite words or explanations. No, they were the type who believed that their rules were more important than boundaries, than property. Lines, than the word no. And I knew something else. Once people like this think they can walk over you, they never stop. The first time you let them push that gate open literally, or figuratively, you might as well hand over the keys to your whole life. So I made myself a quiet promise right then and there. Standing in the shadow of my barn, with the smell of hay in my nose and the grit of dirt under my boots, this wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. They might have their rules and their clipboards and their smug little grins, but I had something stronger. I had time, I had resolve, and I had no interest in backing down. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead, scattering a few dry leaves across the packed earth of the driveway. The moment stretched out long enough for me to feel the weight of it settle into my bones. Whatever was about to start at that gate was more than a visit, it was the beginning of a battle. And out here, battles weren't fought in meetings or courtrooms. They were fought in patience, in persistence, in the refusal to be worn down. By the time I started walking toward them, my mind wasn't on what they were here for, it was already on how I was going to end it. The first thing I noticed was how they didn't move aside when I came into view. Most folks in these parts have the decency to step back when they're on the wrong side of your fence. But these three stood there, like the land under their feet was already theirs. Their matching blue polos were crisp, tucked into khakis with shiny belts, clothes that had never been within 10 feet of a hay bale. They didn't belong here, and every square inch of them knew it, but they wore their presence like a challenge. From where I stood, I could see the polished gold pins on their collars. HOA officers, little badges meant to impress people who cared about such things. Around here, they were just trinkets, a city person's attempt at authority where none existed. Still, they carried themselves like sheriffs from an old western. Except their weapons were clipboards and laminated bylaws instead of 6-dash shooters. It would have been easy to dismiss them as just another nuisance, the kind that blows through and disappears when ignored. But there was something about the way they scanned my property. Their eyes lingered too long on the barn, the livestock, the stack of firewood by the fence. It was the look of people cataloging what they thought they could control. The land stretched behind me, open and calm, but I could feel their attention creeping over it like a shadow. I'd seen that kind of gaze before, years back, when developers had sniffed around this area trying to turn farmland into golf courses. It wasn't curiosity. It was appraisal. A memory flashed through my mind, neighbors from a decade ago, proud of their old family plots, sitting around a table swearing no outsider could ever touch what was theirs. 6 months later, they were boxed into a subdivision, with sidewalks and HOA newsletters stuffed into their mailboxes. Their land had been carved into neat little parcels, each stamped with a rulebook telling them what kind of flowers they could grow. That thought planted itself deep and heavy in my chest. I knew, standing there with the sun pressing warm on my back, that I was staring down the first step of that same path. And the thing about these HOA types is they don't come in swinging all at once. They start small. A request here, an inspection there. They'll tell you it's for safety, for the good of the community. But what they're really doing is testing your limits, finding out just how far they can push before you push back. And if you don't push back hard enough the first time, you'll spend the rest of your life catching up. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of tilled earth from a neighboring field. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor rumbled to life, its sound steady and grounding. I fixed my gaze on the gate. On the way, the sunlight glinted off the iron bars I'd welded into place. It wasn't decorative, it was a fortress in miniature. each welled a silent statement of self-reliance. The hinges, thick and oiled, could hold against more weight than 3 HOA officers combined. Still, I could almost hear their thoughts from where I stood. This could be opened. This could be bypassed. I'd read enough stories about HOAs to know their methods. If they couldn't charm you into compliance, they'd try intimidation. And if that didn't work, they'd drag the fight into courtrooms where they'd wave papers thick with legal jargon. Their goal wasn't to win clean, it was to grind you down until you gave up, just to have peace again. But this was my peace, my land, my rules. And giving up here would mean handing over every quiet morning, every unbroken horizon, every part of this life I'd built brick by brick and fence post by fence post. The officers didn't leave right away. They lingered like they were waiting for the air to break under their weight. One of them scribbled something on his clipboard, flipping a page as though my property were already on their roster. Another looked up at the line of old oak trees by the fence, measuring them with a glance. Maybe they were imagining how the road would look widened, paved, lined with matching mailboxes. I imagined something else entirely. How? Their neat little plans would crumble when they realized this wasn't just some patch of dirt to be absorbed into their grid. This was land with a spine, land with a history of outlasting intruders. By the time they finally turned to leave, the sun had shifted just enough to cast their shadows long and narrow across the road. I stood still, watching, until the last flicker of their blue polos disappeared down the pavement. The gate between us stayed shut, its lock gleaming like a promise. Back on the porch, I sank into the old rocking chair that had been my father's. The wood creaked under my weight, the same way it always had, but today the sound felt sharper. Like the opening note of a song I'd be humming for a long while. The stillness returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It was heavier now, laced with the knowledge that the line between my life and their world had just been tested. I thought of the cattle, grazing slow under the slanting sunlight, unaware of the shift in the air. They didn't care about bylaws or enforcement officers. All they cared about was the grass under their hooves, the water in their trough, the fence that kept them safe. I realized then that my situation wasn't so different. My gate, my fences, my land, those were my protections. And like any good rancher, I knew the value of reinforcing them before trouble struck. The HOA's visit hadn't rattled me. It had sharpened me, made me take stock of what I had, what I could defend, and what I'd be willing to do when the time came. Evening settled slow over the land. The sky burned orange and pink before fading to deep blue, stars blinking awake one by one. From the porch, I could see the faint outline of the road where they'd stood earlier. It was quiet now, but I knew that quiet wouldn't last. They'd be back. They always came back, and when they did, I wouldn't just be ready. I'd be waiting. The next time I saw them, the day carried a different weight. Morning broke in that same unhurried way it always did out here, dew clinging to the grass, mist curling low over the pasture, and the faint glow of the sun rising behind the hills. But there was a tension under it all, the kind that makes even the stillest air feel watchful by now. I learned the rhythm of their movements. HOA officers were creatures of habit, predictable in the way they struck. They didn't sneak in, the dark like trespassers looking for loot. They came in the daylight, loud in their posture, certain their presence alone was enough to bend you. I had counted on that predictability. I was by the shed when I caught sight of them. 3 figures again, but this time their formation had shifted. The tallest of the group stood at the center like a commander, shoulders squared and chin high, while the other 2 flanked him slightly back, clipboards in hand, eyes already sweeping my land. The gravel beyond my gate crunched under their polished shoes, each step deliberate, like they were marching onto a parade ground. The iron gate stood between us, same as before, But today it didn't feel like just a barrier. It felt like a stage. The kind of place where something was bound to happen. And every movement, every look would be remembered. The center officer stepped right up to the gate, his hands gripping the bars like he was testing their strength. I could feel the vibration faintly through the ground, the subtle hum of metal resisting intrusion. Behind him, one of the others leaned forward, peering through as though he could see every corner of my property without taking a single step. Inside, my land stretched out behind me, wide and quiet. But I could sense their eyes trying to carve it into pieces, this bit here for a road, that bit there for drainage, maybe a community garden right where my cattle grazed. For a long moment, no one moved. It wasn't silence exactly. There was the low hum of insects, the faint rustle of wind through the trees, but the human stillness was so sharp it cut through everything else. It was the kind of pause that comes before storms, before gunfights. Before the first blow is thrown, I stayed where I was, feet planted firm in the dirt, my shadow stretching long across the driveway. I didn't need to speak, and neither did they, not yet. The air between us carried enough weight to crush words flat. The one on the left began scribbling, fast and decisive, flipping through his clipboard with the rhythm of someone taking inventory. His head would tilt slightly every so often, as though cataloging every violation he thought he saw. I knew the look. I'd seen it on inspectors who thought a dusty windowsill was reason enough to issue a fine. The third officer, shorter, but sharper in movement, pulled something from a leather binder, papers, folded neatly, stamped with official-looking seals. He held them like a talisman, the kind meant to intimidate anyone foolish, enough to think those stamps carried power everywhere. But the truth about paper is simple. It's only as strong as the will behind it. And my will didn't bend for clipboards, seals, or bylaws written for someone else's world. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow slipping over the pasture, crossing between us and the sun. The land around me felt alive, as if the very soil was paying attention to what was unfolding. Every fence post, every blade of grass, every stone in the gravel seemed to be standing guard with me. The tallest officer leaned closer to the bars. His polished shoes were planted firm on the outside gravel, but his stance spoke of wanting to step through, to plant those shoes on my dirt. I could almost see the frustration in the way his shoulders rose and fell, the tension in his grip on the metal. But the gate didn't move. The lock stayed tight. The hinges stayed still. Behind me, the barn doors stood open, the scent of hay drifting on the breeze. My hound lay in the shade of the porch, ears alert, eyes fixed on the scene. Even the cattle had stilled in the pasture, their heads turned toward the gate. Sensing the shift in the air, the standoff stretched on, neither side breaking. I could tell they were waiting for me to waver, to step forward with some half-concession, to give them even the smallest opening. That's how these people worked. They didn't need to win outright. They just needed you to make the first move toward surrender. But out here, we understood the value of stillness. Stillness wasn't weakness. It was patience. It was letting the other side reveal themselves while you stood your ground. Eventually, the one with the papers stepped back, muttering something to the others. The clipboard man flipped his last page and snapped it shut. The tallest lingered, his hands still resting on the gate as though touching it could somehow make it his. Then, just like that, they turned away. Their retreat wasn't hurried, but it wasn't as confident as their arrival either. They walked back down the gravel road, their shadows stretching long behind them. I didn't move until they were nearly out of sight, their figures swallowed by the shimmer of heat rising from the pavement. The air shifted again, lighter now but charged with something else, a promise. This wasn't over. They'd be back. And next time, they wouldn't just be carrying papers. they'd be carrying plans. I walked to the gate and rested my hand on the iron. The metal was warm from the sun, solid under my palm, unmoving. I tightened the lock, more out of ritual than necessity. The fight hadn't begun in earnest yet, but the first shots had been fired. Quiet and calculated. And if they thought they could wear me down with standoffs and paperwork, they didn't. Understand the kind of patience that comes from working land like this. Patience that could outlast seasons, storms, and stubborn men in matching blue polos. The sun dipped lower, throwing the gate's shadow long across the driveway. I knew then that the next time they came, I'd be ready to shift from patience to action. This was no longer about just keeping them out. This was about showing them what happens when you try to lay claim to something that was never yours to begin with. After the second visit, the quiet of my land no longer felt like peace, felt like the calm before a storm. The air had that charged quality, the kind that makes the hair on your arms rise. Even when the sun was shining and the cattle were grazing, there was an edge to it all, like the land itself was waiting for the next move. I knew they'd be back. People like that always come back. And when they did, I wanted them walking straight into a wall they couldn't climb. I didn't. Start with grand gestures. Out here, winning a fight isn't about swinging first, it's about making sure when you do swing, hit exactly where it counts. My first step was simple. Information. You can't fight someone properly until you know the ground they stand on, the rules they hide behind, and the holes in their armor. So, spent evenings digging not with a shovel, but with my time. County property records, zoning maps, land deeds older than the people trying to bother me. My land sat outside their HOA boundary lines, untouched by their covenants. They had no legal claim here, and that was my first weapon. But I knew they wouldn't care about that. Folks like them always think they can bend reality until it suits their will. The second step was shoring up my defenses, not the kind you see in war movies, but the kind that works in the slow, grinding battles of property disputes. I reinforced the hinges on my gate, set new concrete footings for the fence posts, and welded extra braces to the lock frame. The work was steady and deliberate, the kind of labor that settles in your muscles and clears your mind. Each spark from my welder felt like a spark of resolve. While I worked, I took note of the land just beyond my fence line. A narrow strip of county road ran in front of my property, a forgotten stretch with faded paint and cracked asphalt. If they ever thought they could use it to access my land, I'd make sure it became more trouble than it was worth. Brush piles, rock edges, and a few well-placed planters, nothing that blocked it outright, but enough to send a message that this wasn't an open invitation. I also started paying attention to their patterns. They liked to arrive mid-morning. When the light was good and the roads were clear, always three of them, always in those matching blue polos, always with clipboards and paper in hand. They were predictable in a way that made planning easier, but the real heart of my plan wasn't just keeping them out, was turning their own arrogance against them. They wanted to prove I was the unreasonable one, the stubborn holdout standing in the way of community progress. Fine, I'd give them stubborn, but I'd do it in a way they couldn't touch. I filed a notice with the county about every small improvement I made, every fence repair, every gate adjustment, even reseeding the pasture. All perfectly legal, all properly documented. If they tried to claim I was in violation of anything, I'd have a paper trail longer than their meeting minutes. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about winning against them, it was about making sure they never tried something like this again. People like that spread their reach one property at a time. If I could make my land an example, maybe it would keep the next farmer, the next quiet landowner, from having to fight the same fight as the days passed. My preparations became part of my routine. Mornings were for tending the livestock. Afternoons for repairs and improvements, evenings for paperwork and planning. It was work layered on top of work, but every piece fit together, every step feeding into the larger picture. I kept my eyes on the road. Each time a car passed, I'd note the make, the model, the driver. Most were locals I knew by sight-old trucks with muddy tires, sedans with feed store receipts on the dash. But every so often, I'd see that polished SUV, the one that always seemed to clean for these roads. The one I suspected belonged to the HOA president herself. She never stopped, but she slowed, rolling by just long enough to scan my property, like she was memorizing it. That told me all I needed to know. They weren't letting this go. I added another layer to my plan: public awareness. I spoke with neighbors, not in panic, but in calm, measured words. I told them what was happening, showed them the maps and documents. People out here value independence, and nothing stirs them faster than the idea of someone trying to take it away. By the time I was done, I had more than just my own resolve, had the quiet backing of others who would watch and wait with me. They didn't need to get involved unless it came to a real fight, but their presence mattered. Word travels fast in small communities, and I wanted the HOA to feel eyes on them from every angle. Even nature seemed to join in. The hawk that had circled during the last standoff came back most mornings now, gliding above the pasture like it was on patrol. The oak trees by the fence line grew fuller, casting longer shadows across the road in the afternoon, as if closing ranks. The land felt more alive than ever, as if it knew it was part of the plan. One evening, as the sun sank low and the light turned everything to molten gold, I stood at the gate and looked out. The road stretched empty, the air heavy with that late summer stillness. Beyond the hills, I knew the HOA meetings were happening in some air-conditioned room, their members sipping iced tea and discussing long-term goals. I imagined them talking about my property, frustrated that I hadn't folded. I imagined them pointing at maps, trying to find a way around the boundaries, drafting letters filled with demands they'd never be able to enforce. And I smiled, not out of arrogance, but because I knew they were playing a short game and I was playing a long one. They wanted a quick victory, a show of power. I wanted something they couldn't measure, a victory so complete they'd never try again. Every piece was in place. The land was fortified, the paperwork airtight, the neighbors quietly aware. All I had to do was wait for them to make their next move. Because when they did, they wouldn't just meet resistance, they'd meet the full weight of a plan designed to make them regret ever stepping foot near my gate. It was the third week after their last visit when the trap finally sprung. The morning began like any other, mist curling along the fence line, dew soaking into the grass, and a slow warmth spilling from the sun. But there was a stillness beneath it all, a kind of waiting that had nothing to do with the weather. The cattle grazed quietly, the hound lay stretched across the porch boards, and every inch of my land seemed to be listening. I didn't have to wait long to see why. They came. In two vehicles, this time a shiny black SUV in front, followed by a silver sedan. The SUV I recognized immediately. It was the same one that slowed by my gate on quiet afternoons, the one that had the HOA president sitting behind its tinted glass. The sedan was new, smaller, but equally out of place on this road. Both rolled to a stop on the gravel just outside my gate, engines idling in unison. The doors opened one by one, and the officers emerged. The president herself stepped forward first, clipboard under one arm, sunglasses cutting off her eyes from view. Two other officers flanked her, the same men who had stood at my gate before. Along with a fourth person, a man in a neatly pressed shirt holding a rolled-up set of documents under his arm. He moved differently than the others, his gaze sweeping the property like a man on a mission. They didn't approach slowly this time. The president strode right up to the gate, stopping just short of the bars. The man with the documents unfurled them, holding them out as though the paper alone could break through iron and concrete. The others stood behind, their posture confident, almost celebratory. They thought this was the day they won. The lock on my gate was warm in the sunlight, its heavy frame bolted tight. I'd reinforced it weeks earlier, not because I feared they could break it, but because I wanted the sound of its unyielding weight to ring in their ears. I stepped to the side of the porch, far enough to see them clearly, but close enough to the house to let the scene play out exactly as I'd planned. The man with the documents pointed to something on the page, gesturing toward my land as though assigning numbers to it, dividing it into pieces only he could see. The president nodded sharply, then tapped her pen against her clipboard. She seemed certain the gate would open today, whether by my hand or by the pressure of whatever they thought they held in those papers. But the thing about paper authority is this: it's only as strong as the boundaries it's allowed to cross. And mine were reinforced in steel, concrete, and county law. I'd prepared for this moment with precision. Every improvement I'd made to the property was documented and stamped with approval from the county. Every line of the land deed was clear and uncontested, signed decades before the HOA had even been formed. I'd even gone as far as filing a formal notice with the county stating that the gate and fencing were permanent fixtures under my sole jurisdiction, outside any association governance. What they didn't know, at least not until today, was that I'd also recorded their previous visits. The cameras I'd mounted weeks earlier weren't just for livestock security. They had caught every frame of them leaning on my gate, taking notes, and trespassing across the public road in front of my property. All of it time-stamped and archived. As they stood there, waiting for the gate to yield, I moved to the small table on my porch where I'd laid my own documents. Not papers to wave in their faces, but a neatly sealed envelope already addressed to the county legal office. Inside was a complete report of their unauthorized attempts to access my property, along with video evidence and witness statements from neighbors who'd seen them loitering near the gate the moment their shadows fell across the property line. I knew I had them. The HOA could posture all they wanted, but the county had little patience for organizations that overstepped their jurisdiction, especially when they harassed landowners with clear, recorded proof. The hawk returned overhead, its shadow slipping over the road and the line of blue polos. The president glanced up briefly, then back at my land, unaware of the irony. Predators rarely notice when they've become prey. After several minutes of gesturing, pointing, and what I assumed was a discussion of their authority, they finally seemed to realize the gate wasn't opening. The man with the documents rolled them back up sharply, tucking them under his arm with the frustration of someone unused to being ignored. The president tapped her pen one final time, then turned to walk back to her SUV. But the damage was already done for them, not for me. The moment they'd stood there, attempting to act on non-existent authority, my cameras had caught every angle. By the time they reached the paved road again, my report would already be in the hands of the county clerk. It didn't take long for the results to ripple through. Within a week, I received confirmation from the county office. The HOA had been issued a formal notice to cease any further contact with me or my property. Any additional attempts to enter or inspect without permission would be considered harassment under county law. Word traveled fast. Neighbors told me the HOA president had been noticeably quieter in meetings, her usual confidence dulled. The officers who had stood at my gate no longer drove past. Even the polished SUV stopped appearing on my road. The victory didn't come with fireworks or a public announcement. It came in silence. The kind of silence where you know the fight is over because the other side has nothing left to push. The kind of silence that lets the land breathe again. The mornings went back to their old rhythm: dew on the grass, cattle moving slow, the hawk circling above without urgency. My gate stood just as it had before, but now it carried the weight of something more than steel and concrete. It was a reminder to them and to anyone else watching that some lines aren't meant to be crossed. One evening, as the sun slid low and the sky turned gold, I walked out to the gate and rested my hand on it. The metal was warm, the hinges solid, the lock unmoved. On the other side, the road lay empty, stretching quiet into the distance. I thought of all the work it had taken to reach this point of the paperwork, the planning, the patience. Revenge hadn't been about shouting or confrontation. It had been about outlasting them, turning their own arrogance into the rope they'd hung themselves with. And as I turned back toward the house, the boards of the porch creaking under my boots, I felt the land settle into itself again. The fight was over. I'd won on my terms. And the best part was knowing they'd remember that gate for a long, long time.